Picture this. You're standing on a flat, treeless plain in what is now central Ukraine. The wind has nowhere to break. Temperatures sit around minus 20 degrees Celsius. There is no forest for 100 kilometers in any direction. No timber, no branches, nothing to burn for shelter. And yet, somehow you need a roof over your head tonight. Now look down. The walls around you aren't wood, they're bone. Skulls stacked in interlocking rows, jawbones wedged between them like bricks, curved tusks arching overhead to form the frame of a doorway. You are standing inside the remains of at least 20 mammoths, some estimates go as high as 60, assembled into a house. This isn't speculation. In 1965, a farmer near the village of Mezhirich, Ukraine, was digging a cellar and struck bones 6 feet down. What archaeologists uncovered over the following decades were 4 separate dwellings, built roughly 15,000 years ago, each one constructed almost entirely from mammoth remains. One structure alone used 385 bones from an estimated 60 individual mammoths. Here's the disruption. These weren't tents held up by a few tusks for decoration. They were load-bearing architecture. Skulls were flipped upside down and stacked to form retaining walls nearly 1.5 meters tall. Long bones were slotted together like interlocking joints. The structures were circular, some over 12 meters across, built to hold multiple families through winters that could last 8 months. This detail changes something fundamental about how you think of Ice Age humans. Forget the image of a lone hunter dragging a carcass back to a cave. What you're looking at is closer to a construction project. Logistics, labor, and material science. Executed by people with no metal tools, no wheels, and no written plans. 13,000 years before the pyramids at Giza existed. That single fact will change how you see the line between surviving and building a civilization. Let's start with Mezhirich itself, because the site raises a question before it answers one. Where did all these bones come from in the first place? By the time these houses were built, the mammoth population across the Ukrainian steppe was already under strain from a shifting climate. A single adult mammoth could weigh up to 6 tons and carry a skeleton of roughly 250 bones. To build one house, the people at Mezhirich needed the remains of dozens of animals. Bones that, based on weathering patterns found by archaeologist Olga Sofer in the 1980s, weren't all fresh. Some showed signs of having sat exposed for years before being collected. That detail split researchers into 2 camps. One argument, this was evidence of organized mammoth hunting on a scale nobody had previously credited to Ice Age humans. The other argument, people weren't hunting the mammoths at all. They were scavenging them, collecting bones from natural mammoth die-off sites, essentially treating an existing bone graveyard as a building supply yard. Either answer is strange on its own. But the deeper you look at the layout of Mezhirich, the less this looks like either explanation on its own can fully account for what's there. Because Mezhirich wasn't alone. Roughly 300 kilometers to the northeast, in the Russian village of Udinovo, archaeologists found the same pattern. A settlement dated to around 15,000 years ago, built from over 3,000 mammoth bones. And at Kostenki, along the Don River, similar dwellings date back even further, some as old as 22,000 years. This wasn't one strange household improvising with what it found nearby. This was a design, repeated across a territory spanning hundreds of kilometers, over thousands of years. That's what makes the next piece of evidence so unsettling. These houses weren't just walls. Inside the Mezhirich dwellings, researchers found deep storage pits, some over 1 meter down, lined and packed with additional bone and ivory. Cold storage, essentially, dug into permafrost, keeping meat preserved through months when nothing could be hunted at all. Alongside the pits, hearths, positioned centrally, ringed with charcoal and burned bone, because with no trees for 100 kilometers, bone itself became the fuel. Mammoth bone burns dirtier and less efficiently than wood, but tests conducted by archaeologist Alexander Pryor in the 2000s showed that when broken and fed correctly into a fire, mammoth fat content allows the bone to sustain a flame for hours. So this was a fully self-contained survival system. Shelter from bone, fuel from bone, cold storage dug beneath bone. In an environment that offered almost nothing else, these communities had engineered an entire architecture of subsistence out of a single resource. But here's where it gets stranger. Some of the skulls at Mezhirich weren't just stacked for structural support, they were arranged with a deliberateness that serves no obvious engineering purpose. Rows of jawbones, alternating direction, tusks placed in symmetrical arcs framing entryways. At a related site, Dolní Věstonice in the modern-day Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered mammoth bones marked with red ochre pigment, a substance that took effort to source, grind, and apply, offering zero functional benefit to a wall meant to block wind. That's not the kind of decision a starving, freezing group makes if bear survival is the only thing on their minds. Ochre and symmetry cost time. Time is the one resource that should have been scarcest of all, in a place where every hour not spent hunting, gathering fuel, or sealing a wall against the cold was an hour closer to death. Except there was a problem with assuming this was really about scarcity in the first place. Because the more researchers studied Mezhirich, the more it looked less like a desperate outpost and more like a hub. Excavations turned up amber beads that originated near the Baltic Sea, over 500 kilometers away. Seashells from the Black Sea coast turned up too. Objects with no survival function whatsoever, carried, traded, or gifted across distances that would take weeks to walk. This wasn't an isolated group clawing out an existence in a bone hut. This was a node in a network connected to other communities across the Eurasian steppe, exchanging materials that mattered for reasons beyond warmth or food, which reframes the ochre, the symmetry, the careful stacking of skulls in matching rows. A structure like this wasn't only shelter, it was a statement, something visible from a distance on a landscape with almost no other markers, saying, people live here, people have lived here for generations. This is not just a camp. It's a place. That idea gets even harder to dismiss once you consider how long these sites were used. Soil analysis at Mezhirich shows layers of occupation stretching across hundreds of years, not a single winter. Families didn't build one house and abandon it. They returned, rebuilt, reinforced, added on, treating the same coordinates on a featureless plane as home, generation after generation. The way you might return to a family house that's been added onto by grandparents you never met. And that's the detail that sits strangely once you step back from the bones entirely, because 15,000 years is not a long time by the standard of the mammoths themselves, a species that had walked the Ukrainian steppe for hundreds of thousands of years before a small group of humans learned to use its remains as architecture. Within a few thousand years of these houses being built, the woolly mammoth was gone from mainland Europe entirely, hunted and outcompeted into extinction by roughly 10,000 years ago, which means the animal that gave these people shelter, fuel, and storage was also, in some part, undone by the very ingenuity that made survival possible. The walls that kept a family alive through an 8-month winter were built from a species whose population was already sliding toward zero, and neither the mammoths nor the people building around them could have known it. You don't build a bone house because you're desperate. You build one because you're a species that looks at the only material available on a frozen, treeless plain and decides that's not a limitation. It's a set of instructions. The same impulse that stacked those skulls into walls 15,000 years ago is still the one at work every time you look at nothing and see the outline of something that could stand.